Hello again. I'm here with Dr. Tom Sykes, who's from the Film, Media and Communications School and is a journalist and an author, and Dr. Louis Netter from Art, Design and Performance, and Louis is an illustrator. And we're going to discuss Louis and Tom's research in a little bit more depth here. So can you tell us about your project, Coast of Teeth?
Yes, so this is, so over the last 2 years really, Louis and I have visited 21 seaside towns in England and reported on them. Louis is obviously a reportage illustrator, and so his reporting has been visual. I'm a journalist and author, and so I've done the words. And what we've tried to do is to sort of understand some of the kind of challenges facing seaside towns. We're not sociologists, we're not political scientists, we're creatives. And so our approach has been to go into the field, not unlike a kind of social scientist or a political scientist or a hard scientist would, but what we've been looking for is sorts of, talking to people, getting a sense of people's feelings and thoughts about living in seaside towns, getting a sense of these challenges which range from ecological to social to political, and their impacts on people at the ground level, really.
And I think one of the things that we did in the project as well is be very much on the ground and wearing out the shoe leather, so walking. I think in Torquay, which is the first place we went, we managed to walk, I think, about 14 miles in a day, I think, which is quite astounding. But we're basically encountering the place as well, quite literally. So we're encountering people as we're walking, we're encountering sort of events and things, and essentially keeping an eye out for emblematic moments that are maybe metaphors for something else, people's social, economic, political reality, and being open to these experiences, Tom being able to sort of write about them, me being able to sort of draw them, we're able to capture and kind of contain a sort of snapshot of the lived reality in some of these locations, which really are marginal, liminal spaces on the periphery of kind of wider British society in many respects, shrouded in kind of nostalgic ideas about the seaside, economically kind of deprived. There's very little development in these areas, and in those spaces, some sort of social ills kind of come. But really, it's about walking, talking, and drawing, which has been a really interesting way of exploring and understanding place.
So the drawing and the writing are your data collection tools?
Yes, most definitely. Yeah.
And I think the key, as Louis said, the key to it is images for both, for both the kind of writing and the illustration aspect of it, and to use his word again, emblems and metaphors. I mean, what we've often been on the hunt for, as it were, when we've gone out to these locations, is a certain encounter with a person, a certain building, a certain kind of natural feature that seems to kind of say something about the atmosphere of the kind of wider community or the wider location, and then kind of expanding that approach, I suppose. You then start to think of seaside towns metaphorically, and some seaside towns being kind of very like kind of bulwarks or fortresses against the world, almost kind of resisting. Okay, they're by the sea, which literally means they are next to a kind of a source of movement, of migration, and boats coming in and out and travel and so forth. Some seaside towns tend to kind of resist that and put their defences up. One could argue that Portsmouth, even though it has become much more sort of diverse in recent years, there's still this, and visitors to Portsmouth will kind of talk about how there's this very kind of military feeling, military atmosphere, with the you've got the sort of naval base on one side, haven't you? And then you've got the square tower and the round tower and these sort of fortifications that run along the coast of Portsea Island. that's very. We felt that that's almost like a kind of that metaphorical way of thinking about a seaside town is very different to somewhere like Torquay or parts of the Isle of Wight, where you get a sense that that's a porous border, between the land and the sea, where actually all kinds of influences from abroad, not just from different places but different times, have been allowed to kind of wash into a seaside town. If you look at Torquay's skyline, which remains quite intriguing, this was the first town that we actually went to and spent time in. You look up and you'll see a kind of like a very angular sort of modernist church, and that kind of seems to belong to some particular milieu, which is very different to next to it is a kind of Debenhams that's closed down, which seems to say something about the kind of something unfortunate and economic about the kind of the decline of the high streets in England for all kinds of reasons, not least people shopping online and so forth. And then you'll kind of, and then it's a very motley kind of skyline, as it were, because you've got the church, the Debenhams, and then you've got something that these kind of very posh sort of stucco flats that look like they could have been something out of Miami Vice or some 80s sort of show. So yeah, it's about, I suppose what we do as creatives is that we try and, it is about sort of using metaphors and symbols and thinking about, using the imagination, I suppose, to try and understand place and the issues affecting places better, I suppose.
So what approaches would you both recommend for researchers who want to gather this kind of place-based information?
I think there's two different things that you could do. You could do your research. You could go to a place having all this acquired knowledge, and then write really knowledgeable, attaching that previous knowledge to the knowledge that you have on the ground. What we did in this particular project is essentially go blind, go without any knowledge to any of these locations, really, fundamentally, and learn as much as we can on the ground. And then later, you were filling in some information that you found and so forth. But there's an interesting thing to do to that. Number one, you're very open to experience in that respect. And you know that this is the way that you're acquiring information. So the way I think about it is it's very granular. And I think for students, this is an interesting thing to do. I use drawing, and in drawing, you're making choices. So you have a fluid reality is in front of you. There are multiple things happening. There are multiple kind of characters. There's the built environment and so on and so forth. You're making a choice amongst all the sort of plethora of visual stimuli. And that choice is really important. That choice really impacts how you pursue sort of value and meaning, and make spaces, places. Places is a place of felt value. So that's the way that drawing sort of functions for me. And sociologists, ethnographers, reportage artists, journalists have been using drawing. Doctors have been using drawings to sort of plan out surgical procedures. So drawing is really a way of mapping, of understanding, of planning, and of bringing clarity. And the drawings in this book really bring kind of clarity of place for me by drawing. And essentially when you look at them afterwards, there's something revelatory about it. You sort of think, oh wow, I really remember encountering that person. And even you're making metaphorical judgments that you don't even fully realize. Like one was when we were in Clacton-on-Sea, and there was this sort of very elderly and very ill person being pushed in front of a large video game that basically said something like Land of the Dead, and it was all this thing. And there was something kind of interesting that you're sort of connecting between these two different sort of subjects, and maybe even also having, again, sort of wider potential metaphorical kind of meaning about seaside towns themselves being perhaps in a sort of in a zombie-like economic stasis. So drawing for me is a way of collecting. It is a way of actually collecting data, but it's it's data that can't be read in a singular way, which is also interesting.
Yeah, and I think you're on the lookout for data that is somehow kind of abnormal or unusual or strange or surreal, especially when it's kind of in a particular context that is somehow sort of doesn't quite match up to, in the way that Louis was saying. I think to sort of give you an example, and one that hopefully be relevant to the kind of tasks that students will be doing for a module like this. There's a chapter in the book called Coast of Waste, and as the title suggests, we spent quite a lot of time walking around the coast of Portsea Island, looking at plastic waste. And it's funny, it's something that's easy to take for granted and not notice if you're just going for a nice stroll along the beach. But once you've got a sort of an agenda, as me and Louis did. We were there to find data or information of whatever kind we could. You suddenly notice quite a bizarre range of items discarded, and then you start thinking about what are the backstories of these objects. Where did they come from? How did they get there? Sometimes the answers are easy. They've just washed in from the sea because someone dropped something out at sea. But then you kind of see things like balloons from children's parties, and you start thinking, okay, then you start thinking about what's the journey that object made to get to here, which, yeah, as I say, is it's the kind of the weirder, the stranger, or the more unlikely details that really, I think, help, or is what we're looking for anyway.
I think as well, with any location, you're drawing it, you're writing about it. You're writing in the present, you're writing in right now, so to speak. It's always right now, of course. But then you're also thinking about that particular location in the past. I mean, Portsmouth is a really great place for that. You've got a place that has a very significant military history and of military importance. So some of these places could be interesting to explore the backstory of some of these different locations. Southsea Common and virtually all of Southsea was just marshland. So there wasn't really anything sort of there. But yeah, so essentially contextualizing your location through writing and through drawing, and I'm sort of saying that drawing might be an interesting way to do that, and might be a way that can feed back into some other insights that you can garner.
Yeah, so it's quite clear that these kind of arts-based research methodologies can uncover and reveal sort of findings and perspectives that perhaps other research methodologies don't uncover. So I just wondered what insight we can gain about the social conditions of the people who live in the 21 communities that you researched. And these are quite often communities who are living at the forefront of, plastic pollution or climate change.
Yeah, I mean, well, the sort of most memorable experience for us in terms of communities that really are deprived and in a bad shape, let's say, would be Jaywick, which is on the southeast coast of Essex, which has it already has been kind of appeared in quite sensationalist and unfortunately sort of fetishizing tabloid newspaper stories and reality TV shows as being kind of, Britain's poorest, roughest town or whatever, and there's no doubt when Louis and I went there that we walked, and we did, again, it was a very long walk, not, to Jaywick first and then to St Osyth and some of the areas around it. And it's a very large sort of space of, people living in kind of almost off the grid kind of poverty with, seemingly not linked up to electricity and with sort of gas canisters in their gardens that they're using rather than being, linked up to the gas, mains. Abodes that look that kind of reminded us of the work that we've done in the global south, like shanty towns where people's houses are constructed out of basically bits and pieces of plastic and other materials that they just found salvaged, around the community. But what was interesting about that was that, whereas we felt that some of the kind of reporting that had been done about Jaywick was rather despairing, or, as I say, sensationalizing, or sort of almost mocking or ridiculing these people's situation. What we found was that there was this pushback in the sense of sort of community, grassroots community efforts, one of which that was particularly affecting for us was a kind of space in a Martello Tower, which is back in the, I think, the period of the Napoleonic War. They built all these towers out of sort of fear of French invasion, so they could presumably see the French ships
Cannons
coming.
on top,
Yeah, and what they've done near Jaywick, it's either Jaywick or St Osyth or somewhere in between, is that they've converted this Martello Tower into a kind of creative space, into an art space, and there were all these really interesting projects that had brought together school kids, local historians, students, you know, say a very grassroots, you know, from sort of not top down, but from down to top, or whatever however you might phrase it, and all reflecting on two issues that are really relevant to this module and this whole project, which is plastic pollution and the very real danger of flooding, you know, because of rising sea levels, because of the climate emergency. So, you know, where we've found kind of despair and social problems and social challenges, there's always been a kind of, you know, we've been sort of cheered up a little bit by the fact that people have, and you know, in those communities are not prepared to just kind of suck that up, and that they're kind of pushing back. The same would go for Blackpool as well, with lots of interesting local arts and theatre sort of projects going on there. But go on.
Kind of runs parallel to, you know, some of the communities that we work with in, in Kenya and Bangladesh. That, you know, whilst people are living in these really difficult circumstances, there's also this incredible creative energy.
Yes, there was creative energy and there was community spirit in both Jaywick and St Osyth. I mean, St Osyth was interesting. There are two shops, well, there are two places. One is a small shop called Dolly's Pantry, which is just a locally run place where they sell everything you could possibly imagine, which is a really amazing visual sight. And then next to that is a pub that was built also for the community, by the community, which was just sort of fascinating and literally off the grid. But both this St Osyth and Jaywick were also they were below sea level. Jaywick did have a sort of flood barrier around it in the kind of perimeter. But it was just interesting to see how totally vulnerable these communities were. So comprehensively vulnerable in every sort of respect. And that was, you know, it made you realize how that the economic reality of these places is really so far from the economic reality of most people living in the UK. And it was interesting to see that, and to see places that were nearly on par with what we've seen in the global south, for sure.
Can I just add something on that point about the kind of the way that, you know, this intersects with kind of social issues? And I mean, something else I think to think about in terms of mine and Louis' methodology. I mean, as creative people, as artists, we're interested in representation at the end of the day. We're interested in representing the world using our disciplines, you know, drawing, writing, whatever. And I think if you're going to do that, there's a sort of ethical dimension to that as well that's important. You know, if you're going to do that responsibly and ethically, you need to be aware of, you know, where others have fallen down. And I go back to what I was saying about some of these kind of sensationalist sort of tabloid approaches, and not just where they've fallen down, but how to kind of avoid the same pitfalls that the ethical and sort of representational pitfalls that they've gone down into. And I think one of the things that became clear, this is fresh in my head because I was just writing about it to a very tight deadline to get something in the journal soon about this. So I think one of the things we realized was that you kind of have to, there's one thing, you know, your lived experience of going into a place and talking to people and getting that kind of up close and personal data, if you like, is one thing, and that's very important. But it also needs to be supported with sort of a wider context, a wider thinking about. And Louis' right, we did try to go in fairly cold to these places in the sense of just being guided by what we learned on the ground. But it was also necessary after the fact, I think, for us to do some kind of background, some secondary research, as it were. You know, so in the case of Jaywick, what we found was, you know, whereas what I found was that these other depictions that seemed kind of somewhat unkind and patronising, what they'd left out was kind of, what they hadn't offered was sort of any rationale as to why this situation had been allowed to happen. And that's a question of politics, and really at the and economics, you might say. And what we found out just by, you know, doing, you know, reading some, you know, doing the book work or the homework as well as the legwork was that, you know, for example, the local MP and people in local positions of power were very pro-Brexit, right, which would have denied funding for exactly communities in a bad situation like Jaywick. So you found this kind of insouciance from, you know, local people in positions of power. We also found that the local MP had voted repeatedly in Parliament against measures to combat climate change, is basically a sort of climate change denier, as a lot of people on the political right are. And then you're thinking, well, okay, maybe that's why, when you look at the wider context, maybe that has contributed to these problems on the ground. That of course, perhaps you're going to have issues with flooding if your local MP doesn't really believe it's a problem, right? So, yeah, it's about what you find on the ground, but it's also about placing that into a context. And unfortunately, it's what's called sense making in journalism, and unfortunately, it doesn't happen enough in journalism. It's not just the tabloid press. Unfortunately, even amongst the sort of broadsheet and the more kind of respectable press, it's also an issue. There are many, you know, sort of media critics that would sort of say that. So, yeah. So it is about a range of methodologies, I think.
I think as well, just quickly on that one, I think if you're, as an artist, you're sort of following your muse. So if I'm interested in a kind of compelling figure, and that compelling figure is a homeless person, and I was just in Prague recently with students, and the way that homeless people beg there is they're on their knees and their elbows, and they're holding out in a incredibly sort of religious sort of pose, this black hat typically, and they're just and head down in a kind of penitent sort of way, and that is an incredibly evocative pose. So therefore, I was drawing a lot of homeless people because I was fascinated by the kind of performance of begging in that particular context. But that would also skew a vision of Prague, thinking that there's homeless people everywhere, although it's a fair amount. But so in a way, the ethical considerations are made slightly problematic by the fact that certain subjects will be more compelling than other subjects. And we found, like in Bournemouth, though, this can be helpful, however, because it can counter a wider narrative or perception of Bournemouth, for example, being very prosperous and very popular and very young and very dynamic and hip. But at the same time, there was quite a lot of homelessness sort of there that we witnessed as well. So I think it's interesting to think about how representation affects the way that we perceive locations. And I think writing does that in an interesting way. I think drawing is just by its very nature more provocative. However, I have found on my travels and drawing people around the world, it's less provocative than photography. There's a perception that photography is taking, but drawing is a sort of dialogue. It's a bit more dialogic.
Okay, well, thanks for a really interesting discussion, and hopefully we'll hear you read from the book
Yes.
shortly, and
Okay.
and
Yep, happy to
see
do
some
that.
illustrations as well. So
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much.
Good questions.
Thank you.